When it comes to coffee roasting, it's still super challenging to find good and practice-proven information from experienced roasters. That's why I was super happy when Sam Corra from Nucleus Coffee Tools approached me and came with the idea to organize sessions on coffee roasting where we get into different topics with the community. Sam is one of the most experienced and probably best roasters out there. He has been head of coffee with Ona Coffee for several years, and as a coach and roaster has supported several coffee competitors, including some world champions, so he really knows a lot about coffee roasting. We therefore decided to set up a series of webinars that are taking place now and in the coming months. The first one has already taken place this November, and it was about the topic of how the processing influences the roasting profile. The whole session took about 1.5 hours, and in this video you will see an extract of this session. If you want to participate in one of the next webinars that will come, then make sure you click on the link here or also in the description to directly register. We are going to have some really exciting topics that are coming. But now let's start and directly go to the video.
So the thing which will happen is, generally speaking, with a wash process coffee, if we don't adjust, this will go into a negative increase, and then we'll look to have some kind of flat line or dead space as it's adjusting throughout the roast. Biggest challenge that we normally see with a natural process coffee is with first crack, it's falling. And then because we haven't adjusted our heat application accordingly, we've started to go back in heat. And that will sometimes give us some of those undesirable, harsh or roasty kind of qualities to the coffee. My advice to all of you in all styles of roasting is you will see more consistency to your rate of rise line with several timed and spaced adjustments over big block changes where you hold large amounts of heat for long periods of time. It will give you a lot of unpredictability. You will generally see, and the best analogy I can use is a top chef when he's working a pan, he's trying to avoid heat spots. So he's constantly moving the heat around in order to make sure that he has control over whatever he's cooking. The most successful thing, and sometimes it means more work and more attention, is several adjustments over a set period of time. What you will notice if you're adjusting on temperature is as the rate of temperature increase is going down, the time frame between adjustments is increasing, which means that towards the end of the roast, you'll be making fewer adjustments because the time intervals between each are, drastically changing. But I find that that was the best way, at least for our understanding, to manage an effective and consistent roast regardless of the style of roast you're trying to achieve. So the big things to look at is drop temperature, turning point, and this is the rate of rise, which is the heat peak. Generally speaking, when it comes to processing, depending on how much momentum we need, which is a relation of higher drop temperature generally means higher turning point if we are keeping the same amount of applied heat. If we apply heat later, then the drop temperature can sometimes work as a buffer where you go high drop temperature, you have a long soaking period, and then it will equalize out at a different point. Generally speaking, if I have a fixed drop temperature, which a lot of the time I would work at, let's say I do 180 or 200 degrees, that means that the variation is when I apply the heat. The thing to understand in roasting is you need constants and you need variables, and you need to understand what each do. There's no right or wrong way to work with it. So if you're working with variable drop temperatures, you may then have, fixed applied heat times. If you're working with, let's say, fixed drop temperatures, you will also see, different attributes and times when you apply the heat. For us, we would apply the heat differently when it comes to a natural process coffee, that we know if we want a turning point at a certain temperature, we need to apply the heat earlier and more of that heat at that particular stage, where let's say 10 seconds into the roast, which some of you might think is too early, we might go to full maximum burn because we're trying to get a turn to control the temperature. And I will hold that 100% burn or whatever it is until I reach this point in the roast, and where I've seen a maximum increase of the rate of rise. And then as soon as I see that maximum point, that's when I start what I discussed in this one, this constant and staggered applied heat downwards. So you can see for this particular roast, an expression is what I've decided is at 220 degrees, I might have gone 20% of the burn capacity, 60% of the burn capacity. And then when I've hit, rate of rise, when I've hit turning point, that's when I've applied my maximum amount of heat. I've held that level until I've hit this point in the roast, which is the maximum heat peak of the roast. And then I've staggered my progression down from that point. Is an example of how I would use it. And as I said, naturals, generally speaking, you will need to make those applications of heat or the amount of heat applied higher in order to control those stages in a little element. What I would generally do is I would apply more heat for those coffees. I would hold more heat or smaller incremental changes throughout these stages, and then make much larger incremental changes of higher values. Let's say I'm going 5%, 5%, 5% down for a natural. And then because I want to make sure I'm in control of the amount of heat coming into first crack, that's when you might see me going down in 10%, 20%, or whatever the staggered amount that I'm varying throughout that stage. Contradictory if I'm talking about a wash coffee for the same process, what I might see is generally that coffee will take on and be more receptive to the heat penetration. So if I drop it at 220, I might have either a lower increase at the same times, or I might have a longer time where I wait until 40 seconds rather than 20 seconds before applying my first burst of heat. And then I might get to a full burn, but then before I've even hit the top of the heat peak or the highest point, I may look to cap the heat, which is restricting how high that increase goes if I know that if I go too high, it's going to force a too early first crack. Generally speaking, for the anaerobic coffees, you will generally see them wanting to turn at a lower ratio down here, which means that I will generally speaking apply earlier bursts of heat or higher bursts of heat at the same fragments of time, turn them a little bit earlier, and the way in which I'm able to control the outcome of the roast and extend out a later first crack is, again, doing standardized, slightly lower but more frequent adjustments, but more aggressive and higher adjustments before first crack, just before first crack, holding a lower increase to make sure that the first crack is at a time frame that I've intended. So for filter, I find that different processes, we work a little bit different. Like cupping, the intended purpose is we understand the brewing parameters. We understand how a coffee is going to be generally prepared so that we can have a more fixed, roast time that we may decide works for our particular environment or company or wherever we're doing. Maybe it's our kitchen bench. When it comes to filter coffee, it's more varied because this is when we start to put our own independent views and thoughts into the process and what we hope to achieve. So because we might extract a coffee differently with a different device, it gives us the freedom to play around with more variables. So what I would suggest is generally you will see different roast times, different development percentages, different amounts of applied heat, depending on us manipulating those organic compounds and characteristics that a coffee have. I wanted to use some of the Link examples because I think it makes it easy for some of the rationales in how we would use them with the different roast plans that we provide, and just a kind of description of some of the characteristics of how these plans were done so that you can potentially understand some of the applied theory. So the thing which I would say, and the focus is, I want to focus on these pink, red, and yellow lines, which are the top ones. These are the shorter roast plans. Technically speaking, when we have those anaerobic coffees, spending less time in the roaster and controlling the burst that we might have, a first crack, let's say our target time is 7 minutes. We might have first crack occurring at, 6 minutes 20 or whatever. The shorter roast time, but with higher intervals of heat earlier, allows the characteristics I generally find to be more juicy, more plump, more rich. It also allows us the opportunity for a higher percentage of caramelization or development without burning the characteristics of the less available sugar or bringing heavy or over roasted qualities that suit more toward an espresso style coffee. When I get into the natural style of coffee, I will then vary approach depending on the outcome that I would like to achieve. I generally find that this approach with the more shorter or quicker roast works really well for naturals. It keeps the vibrancy. The thing that we know with natural processed coffees and anaerobic naturals in general, or that is tendency-wise, they generally have more body or more fullness to the profile, which means the things that we're trying to work on the most is balancing the acidity and the flavor and the aroma. Now, if we do too long roast and we do too high development, we start to change the balance. I brought back that reference of where development occurs. If we shift the development percentage higher, we start to break down more of the qualities that we've developed before first crack. So if we go towards a roast that is longer and a higher amount, we will break down more of those elements that we want to keep. Now, when it comes to natural and most heavy anaerobic naturals, the things that we're really trying to get is freshness, brightness, acidity, those softer notes. I generally find that you will achieve them more successfully with a more quicker roast approach to those coffees. You can play around with some of the longer approach for those naturals and anaerobics, but it's at a drastically shorter amount of development percent. Otherwise, you run the risk. And even then, what you will notice to those coffees is they won't have that vibrancy and that strength that you would like to achieve. So the thing to remember is generally with filter coffees, we're doing a higher level of dilution, which means that the strength in the beverage is achieved over a longer contact of that coffee stretching over a longer volume of water. So what we need to understand is everything in that coffee needs to be more intense acidities, more intense flavors, more intense aromas, so that when we apply it to that particular beverage we want to do, we achieve the best expression over that intended use that we're looking for. So when it comes to more wash process coffees, some of the challenges that we're looking to have is, generally speaking, we have an abundance of acidity. We have more vibrant, more clean, more rich attributes. We generally don't have, and this is a very stereotypical approach or view of it, as much sweetness or as much body to those coffees, that we may need to look to adapt the way in which we roast to make sure balance is achieved by focusing on what that processing method does not naturally have. Natural process anaerobic coffees have lots of character, lots of flavor, and generally, because of the process, more perceived body, but they have lower acidity, where it's counterintuitive when it comes to the wash process coffees, that for balance, generally we're looking to break down the intensity of acidity so it's not as intense and it's more harmony, but making sure we have enough sweetness and body to complement the characteristics that we get from origin or variety, which is generally why most of the time, and you'll see this green profile, which is the longest profile, the green profile and the brown profile here are generally what the algorithm I've coded will select for wash process coffees, because I want to spend a longer amount of time before having first crack and focusing on the length of the roast to assist in some of the characteristics that the coffee doesn't naturally occur or have because of the process of the coffee. One thing that you'll notice is, at least for me, depending on varying different amounts of extraction, brewing methods, etc., that I generally have a fixed development percentage or time that I like to do for filter coffees. And you will see that varying depending on the roast approach. So if you went into the Link system, you did a compare of an C and E kind of profile, or Martin's profile, which we roasted for the World Championship, you'll notice that even though they have, 10 or 13% development, the time that we've spent after first crack is that shorter period where it's anywhere between, let's say, 35 seconds to a minute, depending on what we want. And even though these profiles are longer, when we talk about the B, the D, or the A profiles, we still respect that balance between time as the percentage that you may see as low as 8% recommended for the D profile, and, you know, as little as 10 or 9 or whatever for these other profiles. It's about thinking about what we're trying to achieve, knowing that before first crack, we're developing the characteristics, and after first crack, we're dictating the intensities that we would like to get out of the coffees.
I hope this video was interesting for you and you learned a lot. If you want to participate in one of the next webinaries, then make sure you directly register. You find a link in our description with all the next topics and all the next dates and the possibility to register. I hope to see you soon.